Paraic O'Brian, you're our foreign correspondent. You've just been out in Tunisia reporting on the migrant crisis, on the boats of asylum seekers and refugees trying to make it to Europe. What are you going to tell me?
I'd like to talk about the bigger picture, why people are leaving, the spike in the numbers of people leaving Tunisia for Europe, but also do that through the prism of this one morning when we stumbled across a terrible tragedy on a small fishing port called Alusa.
So, Paraic, you've been looking at the Mediterranean migrant crisis, which obviously came to the fore once more with the terrible tragedy of the sinking of a boat off the coast of Greece. That boat, of course, came from Libya, but you went to neighbouring Tunisia. What took you there, and what did you see in a place called Alusa?
So we went there because there's been a big spike in the number of migrants and asylum seekers that are leaving along that central Mediterranean route. So these are typically people from sub-Saharan African countries. They are transiting through countries like Tunisia and Libya, trying to get to Lampedusa in Italy. Tunisia is becoming a real hotspot. It's becoming a huge transit area for people trying to get to Lampedusa. So that's why we wanted to go initially. We were there for a few days and we were told that we should go to this working fishing harbour called Alusa. It is about an hour's drive north of Sfax, which is in sort of southeast Tunisia along the coast. And we didn't know what to expect. We were told that regularly there are incidents, people leave from around that particular fishing port. We arrived at about 8 a.m. one morning. And it was, what we saw really was quite shocking. As we approached this fishing harbour, there was sort of, on the face of it, it looked like a normal working fishing harbour. There were fishermen. There were these like big mounds of these clay octopus pots they use, fishermen going about their business. But as we made our way down the length of the harbour, it was as if someone had sort of slightly turned down the volume of the place. Conversations became more muted. Something was amiss. And then at the end of the harbour, we saw a group of migrants and asylum seekers. It was a desperate, desperate sight. At the small harbour of Alusa this morning, shallow breathing in fishermen's nets, the substitute for intensive care. Of those rescued, there were the people who barely survived and the ones who did not. Fishermen immune to this now told us this happens several times a week, every week for months. One man was semi-conscious lying on this mound of nets. He was shivering. He was in a very, very bad way. His T-shirt had been rolled up. He had just come out of the water and there were all burns along his torso. That comes from a mixture of the diesel mixing with the salt water on the boat that this man had been on that had capsized just about an hour before we arrived. It turned out there were 40 people on a boat. It had capsized that night, way out to sea. 11 people had drowned. It had capsized at about 10. They had spent about 9 hours in the water and were rescued that morning, an hour before we arrived on the harbour. That was just one man. There was another woman called Baraka who really stayed with me. She was sitting on the ground next to him. She was 7 months pregnant. And then next to her, there was a man wrapped up in a blanket. He had drowned. His name was Ali from Burkina Faso. And his friend was just sitting beside him on this harbour, huddled up, wouldn't leave the body. So that was just one incident. This is happening several times a week on all of these coastal villages dotted along that Tunisian coast.
How were they rescued? Is this Coast Guard? Is it just everyday fishermen who find them?
In this particular instance, it was the Tunisian Coast Guard that rescued them. Oftentimes, it's fishermen. And tragically, the ones who don't make it, the ones who drown. We saw this young man, Ali, who had drowned on the lying there on the harbour. But fishermen told us that throughout that day, the other 10 corpses would wash up along the coastline.
And the fishermen are also saying that this happens on a regular basis.
Yeah, I mean, it really struck me. While we were there, this fisherman showed up. His name is Wahid Dahek, and he's a sort of quite respected fisherman in the area. And he's adopted this kind of informal role in the local community where if a corpse washes up, he's the person that people will go to alert him, because they're reluctant to go to the authorities because it becomes complicated. They have to give statements, etc. So this man, who's just an ordinary fisherman, has become this informal. He's the guy that people go to alert to alert him about corpses washed up. And he told us like awful stories. I mean, this man was obviously traumatized by what he had seen, because he would go and try and retrieve bodies from the beaches. He told us terrible, terrible stories of children out swimming and coming across the corpses of other children floating in the water. He told us that he has stopped eating fish, even though that's his life, that's his community's life, because some of the fish feed on the corpses. He told us stories of elderly people in his neighbourhood now reluctant to go for like a walk along the seafront in the evening lest they stumble across a corpse. So these were the types of stories, I must say, that really brought home the scale, the tragic scale of what's happening along that coast.
And those who you spoke to, traumatized, who survived, despite what they went through, do they still want to do that journey again?
Yes.
Really?
Like even the people that had literally been just plucked out of the water were telling us we're going to try again. And what's interesting is that, as the Tunisian Coast Guard, and I know we'll get to this, but as they continue with the offer of money from European countries to try and clamp down and turn back the boats, what's actually happening is the smugglers know that's happening. The smugglers are adapting their products. So what typically will happen now, which is relatively new, is that for the price of a crossing, you'll actually get 4 goes. So the smuggler will say to you, you pay the equivalent to £500, let's say, to cross from Tunisia to Lampedusa. Last year, that got you 1 crossing. If you were turned back, all bets were off, you lost your money. Now, smugglers are saying it's a package now. You get 4 goes. If you get turned back 3 times, 1 time, you get turned back another time, you get 3 or 4 goes. That's all covered within the price of the £500.
Paraic's story comes after the tragedy off the coast of Greece recently, where an overcrowded fishing boat capsized, leaving 80 dead, with the United Nations saying 500 are still missing weeks later. They were travelling from Libya, which was once the main departure point for migrants heading to Europe. But EU leaders agreed to new measures with Libya to reduce the arrivals, training coastguards and improving border management. While that appears to be partly working, neighbouring Tunisia is now the hotspot. The Italian Interior Ministry reported that 42,000 people had arrived in Italy from Tunisia since the beginning of this year. That's a 3-fold increase on last year. And it also, of course, means that the fatalities are rising too. And despite the EU trying to stem the tide overall, the numbers are still high across the Mediterranean, with nearly 160,000 people arriving by boat last year. Let's discuss, why Tunisia and also who are these individuals? I mean, for example, on that tragic crossing that you witnessed, where were they from?
So the top nationality of crossings this year are from people from Côte d'Ivoire. We met a lot of people from there. Burkina Faso is another increasing nationality of people trying to get across. We met quite a lot of Nigerians, people from the northeastern Nigeria, sort of Boko Haram country. And again, it's the usual story. It's a mix of like dire poverty, strife, conflict, and also, families designating a person to go on their behalf, go for a better life, make as much money as you can, send it back to us.
And why Tunisia? Is that because, not just because of its geography being somewhere you can obviously set sail to to Europe from. But obviously, neighbouring Libya, for example, there's been more of a clampdown there in terms of the crossings.
That's correct. I mean, if back at the height of the refugee crisis in 2015, 2016, the numbers coming out of Libya was the main transit country. What's changed, of course, over the years is the European Union and European countries have done deals with Libya, have paid the sections of the Libyan government / Libyan militia to police this for them. So to intercept the boats off the coast of Libya, bring people back, put them in detention. Of course, they get out of detention, they try again, and the Libyan militia are involved in both the stopping the boats, accommodating them once they bring them back, and then they go back into the system and the system recycles itself. Libya has become an absolute horror show as far as refugees and asylum seekers are concerned. The stories you hear coming out of Libya would make your skin crawl. That message is percolating back to the countries that these people are leaving from, and Tunisia is becoming the country of choice next door to Libya.
But interestingly, in your report, and what you just said there, this idea that Libya is now a hostile environment for asylum seekers and refugees. Tunisia itself is seeing itself becoming a hostile environment because even from the man in charge in Tunisia has started speaking out against migrants.
Yeah, that's right. So the President Kais Saied gave a really incendiary speech in February, where basically he said, people coming from sub-Saharan Africa are like diluting the Arab demography of Tunisia. It was a really, really incendiary speech. Off the back of that, there was a whole spate of violent attacks directed at migrants in Sfax and in Tunis. He is an authoritarian populist. He is not afraid of weaponizing the whole migrant issue, of using migrants as both leverage when it comes to getting money from European countries who want him to police their borders, and also using the whole migration issue as a lightning rod for his populist politics. And we saw that play out in a very real way on the ground. So just to give you an example, there was a young man called Musa who we have been recording his attempts to cross. He was turned back by the Tunisian Coast Guard a few weeks ago, and we went to meet him recently. And just to give you a picture of the situation that he is in, he's in a really, really poor, down-at-heel neighbourhood on the outskirts of Sfax. He is living in an unfinished, squalid property. There are 7 young men, migrants and refugees, in this property. It's being rented out to them by a local Tunisian. But here's the thing. They are reluctant to leave that house on their own because over the course of the last 2 or 3 weeks, marauding gangs of local Tunisian youth have been targeting black African migrants in that particular neighbourhood. These men are reluctant to leave the house, so Musa and his friends are struggling to find work on the black market, struggling to save the equivalent to the £500 they need to pay smugglers for the crossing again.
We've therefore spoken about the tragic story that you saw and also who are the people who are actually travelling to Tunisia. You also did a bit of work in terms of how the individuals, once they get to Tunisia, to Sfax, how they then manage to get onto one of those crossings, however many attempts. What did you see in terms of how that smuggling process works?
Well, the first thing to say about the smuggling process is it's happening in broad daylight. There's the Medina in Sfax, and that's where lots of this business happens. Everything is advertised on Facebook. People are competing with each other online to offer smuggling packages. It's easy to come across. So we did a little bit of digging. We were speaking to the police, people in the know when it comes to the smuggling operation. And basically what happens is once the migrant or asylum seeker has enough money. Typically, a crossing would cost them around £500 to get from Tunisia to Lampedusa. What happens is they get the call in Sfax, they get a taxi or they're bussed out to one of the coastal villages north of Sfax, typically. These are like vast coastal olive groves. And in the olive groves, there are collections of derelict buildings, like we're talking over like 100-kilometer stretch. They will camp in one of these derelict buildings. On the night of departure, a lorry will arrive at their derelict building, which is by the water. It will have a metal boat will be on the back of the lorry. They tip the metal boat into the water. The migrants and refugees come out of the derelict house, jump on board, and off they go. It takes less than a minute. We saw a video of it. It happens incredibly quickly. The interesting thing for me about the whole smuggling operation in Tunisia is that it is completely knitted into the local economies in these villages. So typically, you will get a local teenager on a moped who will be a spotter for the smugglers to alert smugglers to the presence of police. That teenager, depending on their experience, will get about €5 a day to do that. So that's the sort of bottom rung of this operation. But the top rung of this operation is the person who owns the truck, who launches the boat. That person who owns the truck and launches the boat can make up to €1,000 a day. And there's all sorts of levels in between. So in these poorer communities, this has been going on for a long time. It is family run, it is community run, and to police your way out of something so knitted into a local economy is very, very hard.
What is being done to deal with this crisis on the seas? We already know about what the UK is doing with the small boat crossings on the Channel, paying more towards the French Coast Guard, as well as trying to deter people from coming to the UK.
Our deterrent strategy can work. When people know that if they come here illegally, they won't get to stay, they stop coming.
That mixture of deterrence rhetoric and paying for more policing is being repeated elsewhere in Europe. Italy's governing party, led by Giorgia Meloni, was elected last year on a campaign promise to tackle these migration numbers. And the EU is currently trying to finalise a deal with the Tunisian government, which could see it loan them more than €1 billion in order to revive their economy and finances, as well as deal with the migration crisis.
We will support Tunisia to strengthen its economy.
There's a lot of work to be done, but I'm very hopeful that we achieve our goals.
The idea being that not only pumping money into the country stops people wanting to leave because it reduces the socio-economic problems, but that the money can also be used to more effectively stop any boats coming over anyway.
The problem is there are competing interests here, right? So the prevailing policy when it comes to many European countries now is stop the boats, turn them back, no matter what. Create an environment so hostile within the potential host country that they won't want to come, and then subcontract out the policing of your borders to transit countries like Tunisia and like Libya. The question, I suppose, is how much is too much in terms of the money you're paying or in terms of the morality of all of this? How much is too much? What price tag is too much? And it would appear, on the face of it at least, that there is enormous appetite for this sort of thing with the electorate in some of these countries. So what's happening with Tunisia is, there are layers to it. So, for example, the Tunisian economy is in meltdown. It's completely dysfunctional, compliments of Kais Saied, the president. The negotiations are going on around a giant IMF rescue package for Tunisia. The Europeans want to try and get that deal over the line because they know if the economy disintegrates in Tunisia, what will that mean? That will mean more migrants and refugees coming via Tunisia and from Tunisia to European countries. As part of that whole package, like parallel to that, the Europeans there was a veritable procession of European government ministers while we were there. And they come bearing gifts. They are offering Said's administration millions and millions of euros to try and train his Coast Guard, to try and provide kit to stem the flow, stop the people from coming. And we saw that, we went out with the Coast Guard and we saw that in action. And it's messy. Like Stop the Boats has a nice it's a catchy ring. But what that actually looks like on the water is a very, very messy situation. So typically what you'll have 2 Coast Guard Zodiac boats on a pincer movement. They come in and they try to disable the migrant boat. And at that moment, it is incredibly fraught. The Coast Guard at that moment represents they're like dream busters. These people are on the last leg of their migrant journey. They think they're going to make it, and then the Tunisian Coast Guard rock up to stop them. So things get violent. So, for example, we saw people threatening to light canisters of diesel on the boats. Coast Guard officials we spoke to off the record were talking about an enormous spike in the level of violence directed at them. But that is understandable to an extent because there's so much pressure now on this system that I think the worry is that something will seriously go wrong. I mean, and that the level of violence will ratchet up and up and up, and the pressure will increase to the point that something dreadful will happen.
It seems a bit dodgy, doesn't it, for the EU, this sort of bastion of democracy, freedom, to be seen to right now, as you say, a procession of them trying to cut deals in Tunisia, having cut deals in Libya. How does the EU respond to that, this idea that it can do these deals?
What the EU would say is that the promise of this funding comes with human rights guardrails, so there are guarantees built into this. Yes, they are giving them money for kit, and yes, they are giving, populist authoritarian regimes money, but there are guarantees built into that. There are human rights strings attached, if you like. There is understandable skepticism around that, though, right? So if you look at Kais Saied, he is a populist authoritarian. He is dismantling the architecture of democracy in that country. He is arresting the leaders of the opposition. He is arresting judges, NGOs. Is he a suitable partner for the European Union to do business in? That is a moot point indeed. But the bottom line is this. European leaders have made a calculation that sections of their electorate want this so much they're willing to swallow that. Because it worked in Libya to a certain extent. Let's see whether it will work in Tunisia. Is the argument.
And are they willing to swallow the accusation that would be that, well, how does one apply for asylum in the EU now? Because the argument is that opportunity is shrinking, and that cutting deals to stop the boats in the Mediterranean is happening at the same time that other European countries, as you've seen in your own reporting, are building fences along borders as well.
I slightly balk at talking about the European Union as a whole, right? The political situations within each individual member states is different. But I have to say, though, when you look at Britain, when you look at Greece, when you look at Italy, when you look at France, the debate has just moved on. The refugee crisis of 2015 and 2016 changed everything when it comes to the politics in Europe. The argument around safe legal routes is really, it sometimes feels to me as if it's an argument lost now.
Have we, in the West in some way, in Europe, become immune to this story? Because this is happening on a daily basis. And it does feel that we only therefore discuss it when there is the big tragedy of Greece. And as you say, the conversation, you feel, has moved on from saying, let's not talk about safe routes, whatever, just stop the boats. Do you feel this is a story that we just don't give enough attention to in some ways?
Well, yeah, I guess I do, but I would say that, wouldn't I? Because, I feel like I am very interested in the story and I want to keep reporting on it. I mean, it's human nature, though, right, Kieran, to a certain extent, isn't it? It has been going on for a very, very long time. This is like a rolling, slow-motion tragedy day after day after day, and people only have a certain amount of, bandwidth to absorb the kinds of things we're seeing. But calling this a refugee crisis is sort of a moot point, because politicians want to frame it as a crisis. There's lots of political ulterior motives in framing all of this as a crisis. But I have to say, on that harbour, it was a crisis. It was a crisis for the people drifting in and out of consciousness. It's a crisis for their families waiting to hear whether they've made it or not. So in that respect, I'm happy to call it a crisis, if you like, because that is how it feels when you're face to face with it.
Paraic O'Brian, thank you for talking to me today. Thank you.
Thank you.